Russia on the brink. GDP growth near zero as recession looms. Trump's next move could force Putin to surrender. Zelenskyy holds key international meetings to strengthen Ukraine's defense. Why Orbán sees Brussels as a rival. Ukraine's foreign intelligence is recording systemic signs of a recession in Russia. Industrial output is declining in 70% of key sectors, particularly in the country's manufacturing industry. Foreign trade has fallen by more than 3%, with exports dropping to $303 billion, while the trade balance surplus has decreased by 11%. According to intelligence estimates, Russia's GDP growth for the year is expected to be almost zero. Russia's economic growth has all but stalled. According to Rosstat, GDP grew by only 0.6% in the third quarter. When seasonal factors are taken into account, growth amounts to just 0.15%. Economists are warning of stagnation and suggest that the final quarter could even see a contraction. The Ministry of Economic Development is calling for a cut in the key interest rate to stimulate the economy, while the central bank continues to describe the situation as stable and seeks to maintain the appearance of growth. All U.S. sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil are already hitting Russia's energy revenues, according to the U.S. Treasury. Analysis by the Office of Foreign Assets Control shows that the restrictions introduced by President Donald Trump on October 22nd have achieved their intended effect. The price of Russia's Urals crude has plunged to nearly a 3-year low. At the port of Novorossiysk, the main export grade fell to $36 per barrel, the lowest level since March 2023. Bloomberg reports that demand began to drop following the announcement of U.S. sanctions, which will officially take effect on November 21st. In addition, several major refineries in China, India, and Turkey have already begun suspending purchases of Russian crude and are seeking alternative sources of supply. In recent weeks, Russia's main crude oil grades have been sold at record low prices, further squeezing the country's oil revenues. Trump either goes for carrot or for stick, Finnish President Alexander Stubb told Politico in an interview. According to him, it is necessary to paralyze Russian industry to force Putin to come to the negotiating table. On the previous day, during a joint press conference with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, Stubb emphasized that support for Ukraine and strengthening the alliance's defense remain priorities. He also expressed hope that the European Union will be able to resolve the issue of funding Kyiv ahead of the EU summit scheduled for December.
Ukraine's financial needs for the coming years must also be tackled urgently. It's obvious that Russia will remain a long-standing threat to security and stability of Europe, even after the war in Ukraine is over. NATO and Europe needs to continue to strengthen our defenses to respond to these threats.
Donald Trump has given the green light for new sanctions against Russia. Congress is now moving forward with consideration of a bipartisan bill introducing additional restrictions on Moscow, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham reported. According to Graham, U.S. sanctions against Russia's 2 largest oil companies have already had a significant impact. He expressed confidence that the new legislation will provide Trump with even more tools to help end the bloody war in Ukraine.
The legislation allows Trump to impose secondary sanctions and tariffs at his discretion on countries who continue to buy cheap Russian oil and gas, propping up Putin's war machine. This legislation is designed to give President Trump more flexibility and power to push Putin to the peace table by going after both Putin and countries like Iran that support him. Lindsey Graham, Republican senator on X social network.
Russian energy giant Gazprom is moving forward with plans to build a new gas pipeline to China, according to the Financial Times. Moscow is currently developing detailed project documentation, a sign that the Kremlin believes in reviving the long-abandoned project, the publication notes. Financial Times analysts point out that Power of Siberia 2, which could transport 50 billion cubic meters of gas per year, is Russia's only realistic hope to offset part of its lost exports to Europe. Moscow and Beijing signed the original Power of Siberia agreement back in 2014. However, The project remained dormant until Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Only in September 2025 did Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping sign a construction memorandum. Following this, Gazprom engineers began work on the technical design of the new pipeline. After a combined visit to the Sheshkaris oil transshipment terminal, owned by Transneft, in Novorossiysk, a wave of statements appeared in the Russian media about alleged risks to foreign oil suppliers, primarily Kazakhstan. Russian sources claimed that Ukrainian attacks could threaten the operations of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium. However, available data do not support these risks. While a significant portion of Kazakhstan's exports, about 55 million tons annually, does pass through this consortium, it is 51% controlled by Russia, and the system itself contains a substantial share of Russian oil and Russian company interests. Thus, claims about threats to Kazakh supplies appear exaggerated and seem to be used primarily for informational pressure. Kazakhstan will need to decide whether it is willing to continue relying on infrastructure partially controlled by Russia. Ukraine, meanwhile, continues to demonstrate that in wartime conditions, any assets used by Russia to fund aggression cannot be considered safe. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is in the midst of a series of high-stakes international meetings. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is meeting with King Felipe VI and Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez in Spain as part of his ongoing international diplomatic tour. In addition to these high-level talks, the Ukrainian leader will visit a local defense company and meet with representatives from other defense firms. We hope that another strong country will provide more support to protect lives and help bring the war to an end, Zelenskyy said. The president emphasized that his discussions with Prime Minister Sanchez aim to secure agreements that will give us, Ukraine, greater strength in defending Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy will visit Turkey on Thursday to push forward diplomatic efforts and present a series of Ukrainian proposals to international partners. The president stressed that Ukraine's top priority remains the return of prisoners and the resumption of exchanges. In 2025, Ukraine and Russia held 3 rounds of talks in Istanbul. Kyiv confirmed its readiness for an immediate ceasefire, demanding a full halt to frontline fighting and attacks on civilian infrastructure. Moscow, however, rejected the proposals, issuing an ultimatum that included Ukrainian troop withdrawals, a stop to Western aid, and multiple political conditions. So far, the only tangible result from these talks has been prisoner exchanges. Turkey has again offered to serve as a mediator in the negotiations. European Union policy poses a danger to Hungary, says Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. In his view, the EU is blackmailing Hungary and attempting to strangle its economy, allegedly over the country's stance on supporting Ukraine and sanctions against Russia. Orbán even plans to take the EU to court. Meanwhile, his domestic support is rapidly declining, partly due to a noticeable economic slowdown. It is hard to predict what happens next, but as soon as for Viktor Orbán human value comes at an oil price tag, and as long as he sees an enemy in Brussels rather than a partner and an ally, maybe there is a reason for Viktor Orbán to Brexit EU, just as UK once did. Only this time not the country walks out, but a person. Viktor Orbán personally joins Russia, which surely can afford his oil and gas aspirations, at least for some time. So why Orbán sees Brussels as a rival and what it means for Hungary explains our latest report.
Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán stated that his government will file a lawsuit in the European Court against the European Union. The reason is the EU's decision to gradually abandon imports of Russian gas by the end of 2027. Orbán announced this in an interview with State Radio. The Prime Minister accused the European Union of trying to circumvent his veto right on sanctions targeting the Russian energy sector, allegedly disguising them as trade policy. This statement is part of the escalation of conflict between Budapest and Brussels, where Hungary consistently blocks or delays anti-Russian measures, citing, allegedly, a threat to its energy security.
Of course, we will sue them. We will not back down from this. I am fighting for Hungarian interests on the front lines in Brussels, using various means. We do not accept the method Brussels chose to silence the national government. We disagree with the method, which is clearly illegal and contradicts European values. Therefore, we are turning to the European Court on this issue. In addition, I am looking for other actions that could distract Brussels from its intention. Such options exist.
Orbán once again stated that his government firmly opposes EU sanctions on the Russian energy sector, allegedly protecting the country's sovereignty and its citizens. Hungary still heavily depends on Russian energy carriers, despite Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, and continues to use its veto right to obtain exemptions from restrictions against Russian energy. However, analysts see something else in Orbán's rhetoric. He has become a mouthpiece for the Kremlin and repeatedly voices Russian narratives.
In reality, Orbán remains Orbán, and what he states always fully aligns, first of all, with his quite complimentary, to put it mildly, position toward Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and the Russian state as a whole, since Hungary, under Viktor Orbán's leadership, tries in every way to continue economic interaction and cooperation with the Russian Federation.
In the podcast of Axel Springer media conglomerate head, Matthias Döpfner, Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán called not to fear Putin and Moscow. Moreover, according to the Hungarian government head, fear of a possible Russian attack on the European Union and NATO is laughable.
With all due respect, I consider it laughable to say that Russia will attack the EU or NATO simply because it is not strong enough. We are much stronger. Viktor Orbán, Prime Minister of Hungary.
What Orbán states resonates with Putin's position, and the policy of the Hungarian government head is aimed at finding any issues to blackmail the European Union, experts say.
If Orbán doesn't like the European Union, he can leave it. Take Hungary out and be a sovereign state, as the UK did. But at the same time, Orbán wants to stay in the EU. He wants to use the European Union's money, but do nothing that he should do as the leader of a state that is a member of this international union.
Viktor Orbán, who has held the position of Hungarian Prime Minister for 15 years, finds himself in a difficult situation. His support within the country is falling, including due to the tangible economic decline. At the same time, the opposition is getting a chance to win the 2026 elections for the first time in a long time.
We mourn the last 20 years wasted, huge opportunities missed that could have been used to build a functioning, European, civilized, joyful, and humane country. Black is the color that suits Viktor Orbán, because he has become the pallbearer of this state.
Orbán's current rhetoric, aimed at criticizing the European Union and supporting the Kremlin, is designed for the domestic audience 6 months before the elections. He does not want to leave his position. Therefore, he has decided to maximally instill skeptical sentiments against the EU and Ukraine, and he is actively creating the image of a patriot who cares about Hungary's fate, experts say. Orbán believes this way he will gain additional votes within the state. Reported by Natalia Husak, Volodymyr Stenhilov, UATV News.
More updates are on the way. Stay tuned, stay aware, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.